Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to kick off the 2021 Global Conference. My name is Sarah Barnes Humphrey, and I am the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain. And I'm joined by Erik Bush, CEO of Demand Driven Technologies. For our discussion today, the demand-driven movement then and now. We have some amazing speakers and enticing presentations and look forward to spending the next 3 days learning from global thought leaders, listening to some client success stories, and diving deep into new product developments. We're going to spend this session talking about demand-driven supply chains. A huge amount of change and growth is happening in this area, particularly in light of COVID. And so this is the perfect time to pause and reflect on the journey of the theory and the cultural and economic factors that have been at play. So let me take you back in time. Back to the decade I was growing up in, the 80s. Fashion was bold, colorful, and filled with huge hair. New wave, synth pop, and glam metal were all over the radio. And Hollywood was experiencing a golden age of film, churning out hit after hit. The Berlin Wall was torn down and tech advances were coming in thick and fast, with pocket technology from Casio watch to the Game Boy defining the decade. But against this exciting cultural backdrop, what was happening in business, in the economy, and in the supply chain? Erik, let's go to you.
Wow, quite an era it was, for sure. At the time, I was working for IBM in Detroit, Michigan, and I was helping clients in the automotive industry. And it was quite interesting times for them. I don't know how directly Reaganomics had an impact on them, but at the time, the big three were getting their butts kicked by the offshore or the import companies from Europe and especially in Japan, where Toyota and Honda had really started to make a dent in their business opportunities for the big three I'm speaking. And they were bringing more affordable cars with much higher quality and just revolutionizing the way the automotive industry now operates. There was a concept called the Toyota production system that Toyota had developed, very much focused around total quality management. They had learned it from a guy named Deming, who had brought those principles over to Japan in the after World War II era. And they were making great strides with these techniques. And as part of Toyota production system, there was a concept called lean, which is really intended to drive out variation, to get to perfection, if you will, because it was well understood that variation was kind of the enemy of productivity in a supply chain environment. And another concept called Kanban, which is basically a way of replenishing materials, was developed, which allows you to use simple visual signals to pace the resupply of materials coming like to an automotive assembly line. So while DDMRP, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, hadn't really been invented yet, the roots of it were sown based in the Toyota production system way back in that era. And it was striking to see what a difference in the quality of vehicles that the Japanese manufacturers were creating versus the big three in the US. And I think that was kind of where really this demand-driven concept really got its start.
I love that. And you talked about Reaganomics, right? And in the 80s, Ronald Reagan was president. His policies are commonly characterized as supply side economics, which is pretty much the opposite of demand driven. So how and why do you think that demand driven theory just started to come about in the 80s? Was it because the so-called Reaganomics weren't working?
Well, if you remember, the prime rate back in that era was around 10 or 11. I think the Stones had a song, it's going to 11 this time, was the line from Mick Jagger. And so working capital was quite expensive back at that time. And so I don't think the Reaganomics were necessarily working. It was still better than it was at the end of the 70s, but we still hadn't seen it really kind of bear its fruit in terms of economic benefits. Right. And I think because of that, people started getting seriously interested in looking for better ways to, carry their inventory, plan their production, things like that. Another thing that was happening at the time was the introduction of what we called mid-range systems at IBM. There was something called the System 36, then the AS400. company called Digital Equipment, or DEC as it was known, and Wang had started introducing smaller than the big mainframe computers and application software that went along with them to help mid-range and small and medium business gain the advantages of, material requirements planning software and other functionality that was up until then really reserved for only the biggest companies.
Amazing. So talk to me about that, right? Because you're talking about a huge tech boom in the 80s.
Yep.
Was there a relationship between innovation and those new tech advancements that you were talking about, and the demand-driven theory?
I don't think it really was hitting the demand-driven theory at the time, because Toyota's Kanban system, it could be physical bins, so it wasn't really getting computerized yet. But that was one of the great benefits of it. It was so simple that it was easy to implement. You didn't need automation and things like that. I think it was the start, though. IBM had a solution called Mapix at the time, which was a mid-range kind of ERP system in very early days. And clients started adopting that. So you start to see the beginning of a real system foundation outside of the back office areas in most manufacturing companies, where it was really, up until then, computing was about accounting, finance kind of functions, things like that. It really hadn't reached into the more functional areas like production and scheduling and inventory management. There was a concept called material requirements planning, introduced largely with IBM's help back in the early 70s, that had finally started to get some attention in the market. A lot of companies were buying Mapix. They'd buy all the modules, which included MRP, but they frankly didn't implement that yet. They were buying it mostly for the financial backbone that it was providing them in their environment. So you start to see it coming into manufacturing, but I still think it was kind of early days. I think it really starts to take root in the next decade when we get into the 90s.
Yeah, so let's move into the 90s. And all of that bold, bright Wolf of Wall Street greed vanished at the beginning of the decade, with a recession that affected most of the Western world. The decade brought an explosion of pop, with Britpop, teen pop, pop funk, making their way onto the scene, along with supermodels, acid wash jeans, and the girl power revolution. And so this was your backdrop while you were creating Demand Driven, right, Erik?
Yeah, in essence, in the early 90s, 91, I moved back to my hometown, Cleveland, Ohio, to set up IBM's consulting practice and systems integration practice there. It was when IBM was finally getting kind of off the addiction to hardware sales and realizing that there were other needs in the market around consulting services and things like that. And at that time, you're starting to see some things emerge. ERP is starting to take root in earnest, fueled by a couple things. One was the legacy software maintenance for a lot of companies was really becoming a big burden. And they were finding that they were really not in a very cost-effective manner. And solutions like this is the early days of SAP, and those things start coming into the market and started gaining quite a bit of traction. Another thing that was really starting to hit at the time was this worry about Y2K. Right? Because we've got that coming up at the end of the decade. So now you see an accelerating rate of adoption of ERP that is going to help them avoid the legacy software maintenance burden that they've been having, reduce their cost of IT ownership, if you will, and also get them positioned to avoid the Y2K problem. But the logic in those systems at the time, and still today, was largely still the same MRP ideas of the early 1970s. So what's starting to happen too is, as computing is progressing into manufacturing, now the mania about cost optimization starts to really take root. Okay. Where the fixation, because now we have computers to measure all this stuff, let's drive productivity of every work center in our plant. Right. Well, that sounds like a great idea, but it really was counterproductive. And this is where Dr. Ellie Goldratt's work on the theory of constraint really started to get a lot of attention, because similar to Lean and the Toyota system, which are based on true demand and not use your forecast to drive your production and your material planning, it says, let's use the actual demand, the real consumption in the market. Right. And it starts to call into questions. TOC really started to call into question the principles that we should plan to forecast and that we should manage resource productivity at the unit level. And TOC really said, no, focus on your constraints, because they're really what are going to limit your productivity in your whole environment. Pace your materials to what's actually being consumed, because you lose then the bias of inaccurate forecasts. And it really started to gain a lot of traction. This is when I really got most interested in the ideas of TOC. And so you're seeing a changeover in the systems landscape in our clients. Mm-hmm. You're seeing the emergence of some more counter kind of ideas, if you will, to the conventions that were in place at the time, and the massive spread of ERP across the landscape, where clients are basically abandoning legacy systems at a rapid pace, to where by the end of the decade, they were pretty much all but eliminated.
Well, yeah. And all that uncertainty. I mean, I was definitely around for Y2K. And I remember, everybody thinking that at midnight, when we changed into the year 2000, everything was going to go down, and right. Like all the lights were going to go out. We weren't sure what was going to happen. And so I can just imagine that people were, scrambling with that uncertainty, not having a crystal ball, not really knowing what was going to happen. And in the end, nothing happened.
Yeah, well, that too, but something big did happen though. And it was the .com bubble and then burst, right? Where
yes.
While all of this is going on, people are getting amazed. John Chambers from Cisco is on the CNN, financial news every day, talking about how much they're going to grow. And there was so much hype in the industry around e-commerce and web technologies and things like that. And so you saw a huge buildup of interest, companies that got valued at ridiculous levels that later went bust. And, then the ensuing collapse that happened around 2001, 2002. So some new, now you had mid-range in the 80s kind of making its entry. Now you've got e-business and web technologies coming in at the end of the 90s, and another kind of wave of innovation hitting the client landscape.
Yeah. So let's get into the 2000s. And one thing that I'll point out before we do is I was working for a forwarder at the end of the 90s, and we were still working with fax machines and typewriters. So, we talk about e-commerce and technology. It's incredible to think about where we were at in the early 2000s. And, technology was continuing to develop, right? Like you said, at an incredible pace. We saw the emergence of the internet and social media, which ultimately changed the world. But economically, towards the latter half of the decade, there was a big turning point again, which you mentioned, right? We saw massive economic growth in China and India, but a crisis in housing and credit in the US also saw a financial crisis and a global recession. So what were you seeing in the industry during this time? Following on from what you were doing at IPM, what changed and what was the impact of that rapid technological growth?
So in the period from 2001 to the end of the decade, I was really involved as a VP of operations for the consulting division, first in North America, then over in Europe for a few years after we bought PricewaterhouseCoopers. And then following that, I headed up our offshoring, the development of our offshore software development centers. And the thing that you're still seeing kind of the tail end of the ERP migration. And in my role, I saw that a lot of clients were spending a lot of money deploying these systems, but fundamentally, the needles weren't moving at the end. They weren't getting the better on-time order fill rates that they were expecting. They weren't seeing improvements in their inventory levels. And a lot of them went into that expecting, because it was a more modern software, that it was fundamentally going to change their business. And because of the underlying logic was still based in concepts in the 70s, it didn't really materialize. I think that during that time inside of IBM, we were deploying this concept called replenishment for resource management, which the whole idea of it was to pace how we allocated skill sets across the consulting division based on real demand, not the forecast. And we were getting much better alignment of our skills. You come out of Y2K, you've got too many people with legacy skills. You're going into the .com bubble, and now you've got to rapidly transform all your skills. So we were really seeing that this more adaptive and agile and responsive way of managing versus tell me how many Java developers we need in 3 years. I mean, who cares? We'll figure it out when we get there. Became a much more effective way. So I started really getting quite hooked on, the demand-driven way. We were getting much better results out of it. We had seen how clients following their forecasts weren't getting to a better answer. And it really was kind of by the end of the decade, I started realizing that there's some fundamental gaps in the way conventional software is working and what the market actually needs.
And, thank goodness that you did, right? I mean, that's how all great technologies and businesses and companies grow, is really by identifying those gaps and challenging the system and challenging what people are doing, asking the right questions, and also putting together, different technologies and solutions that are going to fill those gaps and just make it easier for everyone to not only do business, but also manage their supply chains. Yeah. But I think, something also important that we need to talk about is consumer habits. Right? Yep. How were those consumer habits changing alongside these big changes that were happening in the 2000s? And how was that impacting supply chain and wider business? And where did you see some of those benefits?
I'd say the biggest factor was the emergence of the power of the consumer. So you've got e-commerce and,
yes,
the beginnings of eBay and Amazon coming and all this stuff. And there was a fundamental power shift from the producers to the consumers in that period.
True.
And what that resulted in was a lot of product proliferation. Okay, so now we've got Coke is bottling into all sorts of different packaging sizes. They're creating new flavors. The automotive companies are trying to provide more options. Cell phones are emerging and they're trying to keep up with the rapid advancement of the technology. I mean, it's just an amazing period to go through. And the challenge with all of that is that if you're trying to forecast against a continually broadening array of product items, you're in a losing battle because you're not going to be able to keep up. The growth of stock keeping units, or SKUs, as we say, was way beyond what people were able to keep up with. And even though companies were coming out with better forecasting algorithms, they really weren't, cracking the nut in terms of giving companies more advantage. One example would be in automotive tire sales. You go back to the 70s, 80s, there were like 10 tire sizes that made up 90% of US auto tire sales, right? By that time, the top 10 tire sizes are less than 30% of the market. Okay, so you've got a big, heavy industry producing tires. You're trying to adapt to this ever-changing range of customer preferences, people. Yep. So it, excuse me, it really became a major shift in the markets where I think customers started to have the upper hand. And it became now much more difficult for the producers to really be able to keep up with that.
So I want to bring up choice, right? And I think fast fashion also came out in the 2000s as well. And so, consumers had so many more choices, and businesses and supply chains had so many more choices that they were giving to their consumers and giving to their customers and trying to keep up with the competition, right? It was just, I don't know about you, but I think Absolutely. It was just this sort of rat race that started happening with the emergence of the internet.
Absolutely. I think it just totally changed the paradigm. And so it's now you've got a much more difficult challenge in ensuring that you have the right products for the market, whether it's even in consumer or B2B. I think there's still a big impact on the range of alternatives clients have, their intolerance. They don't want to wait. If you're stocked out, they'll buy somebody else's product, quite honestly. So it just upped the game for a lot of companies in terms of what the challenges they have to be able to address with their supply chains.
Absolutely. So now that brings us to the 2010s, right? The last decade is surely defined by what the internet has brought. Going viral and influencer culture, all facilitated by social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and of course by smartphones and, constant streaming. Where would we all be without our Netflix binges, right? So this decade brought a huge change to consumer habits. We talked about consumer habits increasing in the 2000s. Now we're talking about them changing their habits to spending, to how brands and their customers interact with each other. And this is when demand-driven technologies was founded. So tell me, Erik, why then? Tell me about how and why it was established and the need it was meeting at the time.
Well, like any great story, it was founded by accident, quite honestly. I had reached the end of my career with IBM and had retired. I was ready to play golf. I started my blues band, and life was
Blues.
good. And I kind of stumbled into an opportunity where a colleague who had helped me with our TOC journey at IBM had, in the ensuing 10 years, developed some software, and had gotten to the point where they realized they didn't want to be in the software business anymore, because it's kind of hard in a small consultancy to be both a tech company and a good consulting firm.
Right.
And we just happened to get reconnected purely by happenstance. Hadn't talked in 10 years. And I thought, this is interesting because this software, it was very early days, but, has promise, because I understood the concepts. It was built around the same theory of constraints foundation.
Right.
But it was also taking a little different look, and it rounded some of the edges off some of the TOC thinking. And I thought, this would be a pretty interesting business. I mean, we could commercialize this. And so I decided to form DD Tech with the company that had initially developed that software. I knew it was going to be a long slog to get started.
Okay.
Because the buyer, you're talking manufacturers, you're talking about the vital organs of their company, their production and their inventory and things like that.
Operations.
They're not going from MySpace to Facebook over the weekend. This is a totally different buying paradigm for them than you would see in other areas.
Right.
But at the same time, if you know that it's going to work, and you also know because you saw how all of those ERP deployments didn't move the needle, and you look up the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that shows that, in fact, manufacturing inventory turnover rates had not changed over the last 20 years in the US, kind of says there's a big opportunity out there because companies aren't getting the value they should be able to achieve. And that really was kind of the impetus. I had a curiosity about it. It just kind of fell in at the right point in time. And, so I kind of got the bug and started the company and started chipping away. We gained a little more clients every year, and they stayed with us because they were getting value. And by the time we got to the late part of the decade, 2016, 17, we had piloted with Michelin. We knew they were going to roll out to 70 plants across their environment. And we wanted to win that business. And we went out and raised some venture capital at that point, because now it would finally mature to a point where there was a very viable market opportunity, a viable product to bring to market. And we knew that by getting the assistance of our investors, we could expand the company more rapidly and really start to turn this thing on. How is it that here we are all these years later from when MRP was first invented, and we can fly to Europe on a plane where knowing that the pilot is rarely flying the plane, that the system's doing the job.
Right.
And yet when we look at how people are planning their inventory, and so many companies, probably 90, 95%, at some point they're relying heavily on Excel.
Yep.
Right. Now, what's wrong with that picture? How come we haven't figured out how to crack this nut? And that really became, to me, the big motivation factor, that we could bring something genuine and valuable. I knew that to compete against ERPs, we had to be different. If they were long, labor intensive, and the needle won't move, we had to be rapid time to value, easy to implement, and affordable. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that whole strategy seems to have been working pretty well for us.
Well, I love your why and I love your passion. So can you remember, thinking back to that time when you were like, I'm going to come out of retirement, what you thought the future might bring? Did you think that demand-driven supply chains would move faster than they have, or slower? And is where we are now the kind of picture that you envisioned?
I hoped it would be fast. My wife certainly did too, but I think, having been in operations kind of roles at IBM and having seen the way big companies operated, I knew it was going to take some time. And we had talked to some venture firms, and they said, you got a lot of evangelizing in front of you because it's going to take a while. And that was absolutely the case. But step by step, you start seeing that, hey, this is going to work and we can get to the next stage. And, there's, I think, a lot of value and persistence in just staying at the task and believing in what you think the opportunity is and what it's going to take to earn the client's confidence.
Absolutely, especially when it comes to technology. So
Yeah.
let's go to our current decade, right? And we began this decade with a real challenge. I mean, 2020 brought us a global pandemic that nobody could have predicted. And so here we stand in 2021. So let's talk about that. How is demand-driven supply chain continuing to evolve, and how has COVID, directly or maybe indirectly impacted that evolution?
I'll take it in two parts. Let's talk about how the demand-driven journey is expanding. We are seeing enterprise clients now who really are ready to start to roll out. We're in an implementation, a very large implementation, and we're going to hit 112 plants in about 18 months. So
amazing.
We're beyond the proof point. We're now to where there's a visceral commitment at the company level to really start to take advantage of these concepts because it works and it gets them better value. So yay for that, right? At the same time, while these are starting to happen, you see the pandemic hit. And my goodness, you go from this uncertainty, everybody retrenches heavily. We don't know if we're going to be able to make it through the year. And, there was so much uncertainty just, exactly a year ago in March, when it really started, we had the lockdowns happening. To then 6 months later, like the automotive industry just rebounds like you wouldn't believe, to where they start trying to accelerate and make up for lost time. In the ensuing months, the dealership inventories drained down. I don't know if people took their incentive checks from the government to go buy a new car, but they started running out of vehicles to what they normally would carry. And so industries, automotive, all the industries we're talking to have seen just an amazing rebound. I think probably the best, I wouldn't say the best, but one of the most important observations would be that because of what's taken place, people are taking a much more critical look at their supply chains and realizing the need for resilience. Because if you are tied up to long lead times from offshore suppliers, or if the way you're managing your business is all predicated on forecasts and you've kind of tried to depend on that alignment, you just don't know what's going to happen. You didn't know the pandemic was coming. You didn't know that the rebound was coming the way it did, right? And now you're trying to catch up. And so you're taking a look at, if I'm a manufacturer, at where could we build more resilience, more flexibility? Not about predictive analytics. It's more about building flexibility and adaptiveness into our business. Because if we do that well, then we'll be able to find our way through whatever kind of rough waters we run into. And I think that is so much more of a modern way of managing when you think about it, adaptability and flexibility. Because then now I don't have to forecast at the item level. I don't have to worry about SKU proliferation as much. I'm going to figure out ways to be adaptable in that and let the market guide where I go into the future.
Absolutely. I love everything that you just said, Erik. And so finally, let's talk about your predictions. We've gone from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s to current day, and you've been through it all in demand driven. So how will it continue to evolve? And will we have a completely different picture by 2030?
Absolutely, there will be a different picture. Today, in these kind of software environments and this kind of solution set, there is a lot of configurations that the user needs to make, whether it's safety stock levels or DDMRP buffer settings or things like that. Those should be done by the system. The system should be smart enough to figure those out for you and not require the user to intervene, right? And so I think that we are going to see, especially through pattern recognition, artificial intelligence, machine learning, that we're going to be able to make the system more intelligent to where a client could deploy the solution with very little outside intervention. I mean, why not? Why can't it be that way that we could navigate with our thumb, right? And really take a lot of the complexity that's assumed to be required and just put it away. It doesn't need to be that way. And so I think where we see the future going is that we're going to get supply chain to feel a lot more like that commercial airline pilot who's monitoring, adapting when needed, using the radar screen and the other instruments to make adjustments, but isn't holding the stick the whole time, trying to fly the plane through the storms and whatever. We should be a lot more down the road in terms of adaptable and, kind of cognitive supply chain capabilities that really make it a much more reliable journey, a much safer journey, and one that doesn't require near the amount of human intervention that we've been used to.
Yeah. And I love that term, why not? And if you at Demand Driven Technologies are thinking, why not? Then we only know that that future is bright. So wrapping up then, what's the one key takeaway that the audience should remember from our session today? I mean, we've talked about a lot. We've gone through 4 decades?
I'm an old guy. I don't know. But no, I think I would just ask him to question. It not take something away, but go back and think about, why does it have to be this way? And question why we've assumed that the status quo needs to continue as we go forward. I think that there are lots of breakthroughs we're going to achieve working together. I mean, we listen closely to our clients. We look for those opportunities to create real value, and just kind of go back and study. Maybe there is a better way out there, because I do think what's happened over the last 30 years or thereabouts, people kind of just acquiesce that this is as good as it's going to get. And I don't believe that's the case.
Wow. Thank you so much, Erik. I mean, what a fascinating look back in time. I absolutely love that. I mean, talk about nostalgia, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And it's true what they say. You can only really understand where you are now and where you're going if you look back and see where you are coming from. We're now going to open it up for questions and answers. So if you want to provide your questions in the Q&A box, or you're welcome to join us up on stage to ask your questions as well. We'd love to see you up here. So let's get to the questions. We've already got a couple of questions in the audience so far. I think that this was a great conversation, and I loved, like I said, I loved going through the decades with you. I want to ask you though, Erik, before I get into some of those questions, what was your favorite decade?
I don't know. I guess as a musician, kind of the 70s. I mean, still an Eagles fan and all that kind of stuff. But there's been a lot of great music over the last few decades. And I think of decades, not so much from my professional career, but around the story of your life told through the music that you listen to and things like that. That's kind of what resonates for me.
I love that. I love that. So I'm also asking that question to the audience. What was your favorite decade? I mean, we went through 4 of them. So we'd love to hear from you guys what your favorite decade was. So let's get to some of the audience questions. So Keith says, great historical overview. How many ERP companies have fully developed and now offer DDMRP in their systems?
Good question. I think as of now, we know that SAP's announced some functionality in the DDMRP arena. I think IFS has a functionality that's been certified by the Demand Driven Institute, and there's a couple other smaller ones, but it's still early days if you look at the ERP market in general. There's not a lot yet. We've actually got some interesting partnerships underway with some ERP companies who have chosen to partner with us instead of building their own functionality in that regard. So we think it's going to continue to grow, obviously. But we also think that there's an opportunity now, where companies, CIOs today, whereas 10, 20 years ago, that it was all about buy a big monolithic ERP system and it'll have everything you need. Now they recognize with better web integration technologies and other tool sets, the fear of islands of automation isn't what it used to be. So we think that the bolt-on or the specialized providers such as ourselves and other companies in the IBP segment have a very great opportunity going forward, because we bring that focus, that discipline around a specific area of the landscape and create differentiated value in that regard.
Great. And that was a great question, Keith. Thank you so much for that. And if anybody else has any other questions, make sure to put that in the chat, or you can come up on stage and join us and ask your question. Jonathan says, you should have made a poll about the favorite decade. We actually had some polls put together. He said his is the 80s because he has fond memories of his childhood. So another question that I could put out to you then, Jonathan, which do you think most defines the 80s? Is it Hollywood movie hits? Is it the colorful fashion, the Game Boy? I think it would be the Game Boy for me, or the hair, So if you guys want to put your answers in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. So Joselina, she has asked, what about cognitive manufacturing?
Oh boy, that's a great question. When I hear that question, I think about manufacturing operations, which is it's a whole different kettle of fish than planning materials. So you've got, all of your machines, your human resources, you've got the types of technologies you develop and things like that. I think there's a lot of room for more intelligence in those arenas. People are very wound up right now about the Internet of Things and having more intelligence in all our machines on the shop floor. Whether or not that's really going to yield the kind of benefits, I think is still an open question. But I certainly think that when it comes to things like understanding our setup times, changeover processes, what are really the optimal batch sizes, other factors that surround manufacturing but aren't really the manufacturing process itself, are going to have a lot of benefit through machine learning and pattern recognition and things like that. The other thing that I think about when I see cognitive manufacturing, I think about this idea of additive manufacturing, where you've now got 3D printing of new parts and things like that. So I think that there's going to be quite a bit of innovation, which, if anything, what I would expect is that it's going to drive the innovation wheel faster for clients, because now they can prototype new parts, features, products to take to market to see which ones are going to sell. That obviously drives the other way that I think many companies want to go, where they're going to have more product proliferation to deal with, which obviously then will feed into needing better ways of planning and managing materials in those regards. So I think it's going to be a very interesting decade in that way. I think when we look back 10 years from now, when we do our 2020 or 31 conference, we're going to be just shaking our head at the changes that are going to occur over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think those are great points. It's going to definitely change how we buy and how we move products, right? Because that'll change whether we're shipping finished products or raw materials for 3D printing. I think it's also going to reduce waste, right? Because you're going to be able to prototype and you're going to be able to put it in the market and get some feedback first, which I think everybody is, from a sustainability standpoint, is really looking at ways to be able to reduce that waste.
Yeah. Yep.
Great. So, Coral, I don't think this is a question, but they say, with more products moving to China, how can we make the supply chain more flexible and adaptable? So that is the question. Being adaptable is key to survive in these uncertain times.
It's a great question. I think over the past few decades, we've seen a big migration of a lot of production work over to Southeast Asia. And I think it was largely driven by cost efficiency kind of metrics and things like that. At the same time, the dark side of that was that you inherited longer lead times. Now it's 90 days on the water to get material in. You've got a whole different set of problems there to deal with.
Yep.
What we've seen through our clients is actually a greater level of interest in reshoring work back to more domestic or regional areas, where they have a better lead time factor to work with. In other words, more responsiveness, and they get appropriate cost advantages, but they're not so tied up. If I have a 90-day lead time on items from China and my forecast is wrong, I've inherited 90 days of inventory, which is not a good thing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the coming years. Obviously, there were some economic policies that were implemented under the Trump administration that affected some of that decision making. It remains to be seen where that plays out. I think we'll probably see, if we were able to help companies understand that it's more about flexibility and adaptability than predictability, and this whole demand-driven movement really starts to take root the way we expect it will, I think more companies will start to look at having more of their supply lines shortened by local providers, giving them more flexibility and more ability to respond to changes in the market. But we'll see.
True. I was having this conversation yesterday on my live stream because we were talking about Volkswagen hedging all bets on the vertically integrated supply chain. And then we were talking about Foxconn is actually putting all their eggs in flexibility. And so the question was, who will win?
Yeah. Well, I think it's all about flexibility. I think companies that understand the power of vertical integration and can have the wherewithal to do that well One of the challenges in any verticalization is that you have to have depth and expertise in all the specialty areas that are part of your product structure.
Yeah.
And over time, specialization really allowed that to be more effective to, move that work to vendors and partners and things like that. But for those companies that have the wherewithal to build a more vertically integrated model, if they understand the DDMRP concepts, they have way more potential to be self-determining how and the way they go to market. Whereas when you have these large partner networks and you're inheriting their lead times, you subcontract full componentry out to a vendor, unless they're doing a really, really good job and are able to turn things quickly, you've kind of, tied yourself up in knots in doing that. So
absolutely,
I do think the smart companies are going to find the effective ways of using vertical integration where it gives them leverage and still leveraging, partners and suppliers where they make sense.
Great. Well, before we go to the next question, I did ask a question about your favorite decade. Jonathan said the 80s because of Hollywood movies, cartoons, and music. And Joe Salinas said the 90s because of the hair and the fashion. Oh, no, specifically in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So thank you guys all for that. We have another question coming in from Kevin. What are your thoughts on how DDMRP integrates with Industry 4.0/X? So working in global supply base, I see the huge value in DDMRP, but the data inputs down and upstream are critical for optimal analysis. How do you see software allowing vertical integration from customers all the way through to tier 1, tier 2 suppliers?
We could spend a day talking about Industry 4.0. I'll just kind of clip the treetops here a little bit. One of the big paradigms that's being socialized in the Industry 4.0 stuff is this idea of demand sensing and having Internet of Things, on, soda vending machines. And so you can monitor the rate of activity, point of sale activity, other factors like that. And one of the interesting things is we've seen this from our clients is that they've got point of sale data, which shows that the actual consumption on their products is rather stable. I mean, think about it. If you're drinking a soft drink, you drink it about the same rate every week, maybe a little bit more in the summer, a little less in the winter, but it doesn't vary that much. If you're in home care or personal care products, they don't really change that much. And yet, if you back up from that, and the Demand Driven Institute even has a chart about this, and look at how they ship against that, now you see more variability. And then you go back up another step to manufacturing, you see even greater variability. So while some people think about Industry 4.0 and having all of this intelligence, if they're still planning their inventory with spreadsheets, I don't know how they're going to integrate those two technologies. I hate to be so facetious. If the heartbeat of how we plan inventory doesn't change and become more modern using things like demand-driven MRP, then whatever gains we think we're going to get on Industry 4.0 tactics and technology, I think are going to be highly mitigated by the foundation, which to me is how you plan materials, how you prioritize production scheduling and execution, and how you use your S&OP process to not look at aligning stars and planets, but rather look for exceptions. Where do we need to learn to be more agile? Where do we need to build more flexibility? Because I think we can do a lot more with less effort. We don't need to know everything to know the right things. And I think the danger in 4.0 industry is that we get a bunch of data, but it really doesn't change how we operate. So
I guess
my
the
2 cents on that topic.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great question, and we've got a couple more to go, but I have one really quick one because you're talking about Excel spreadsheets. So how easy is it for people to transition out of Excel spreadsheets if they are using Excel?
We've seen time and time again, we have over 120 clients now around the world, that as they become more familiar with the demand-driven concepts and they get comfortable with the DDMRP buffer settings, they start to realize that they can pace to actual demand, which is a more accurate signal. So if we have a better starting point with actual demand instead of a forecast, and we build our buffers well, then they're going to be resilient and they're going to allow us to we've got clients on auto approve now where they do not have planners approving the orders. They don't need to. So I think that transition, it's an important one to go through. You have to manage that change effectively, but the success of it has been proven time and time and time again. Right. That it's a better path to follow, at least for a big component segment of the company's items.
Right. So we've got about 5 minutes left. We're going to get to Michael's question. So thinking about the offshore versus nearshore versus domestic supply chain, demand-driven goal ultimately is ROI for the business, but is it difficult for financial systems to connect operations decisions to ROI? How does the APM module help with that challenge?
So Michael's referring to our advanced planning module, which is our solution that supports what's called demand-driven S&OP. And it's really there to again, follow this philosophy of looking for how do we build adaptability into what we call our demand-driven operating model, which is how we manage materials, how we manage production scheduling. The APM allows us to evaluate different alternatives. For example, one of the big ones that's out there is what is the correct batch size? In the old days, there was this concept of economic order quantity and batch sizing, and if we reduce setups, then we produce more units and we have a lower cost per unit, and we think that's better. But in reality, if that then causes us to carry a lot more inventory than we need, that's not such a good thing. So we believe the APM and our approach to this is going to help customers make much more intelligent decisions, be able to surface, okay, this is the implication if we operate in this way in terms of working capital requirements, what our average inventory will be, what our average warehouse space requirements will be for all that inventory. And, you know, as we've seen with so many clients, once they start to get off that fascination with large batch sizes as the way to become efficient and profitable, they start to change those parameters. They become more adaptable and flexible. They shorten their lead times. You don't have to wait 30 days for the next run of a slow mover item because they can fit it into their schedule on a more flexible manner. I think it just sheds light on some questions that have been plaguing the industry for a long time. But does it in a different way than what the normal conventions have been.
Great. And great question, Michael. So Julia says, great points, Erik. How can DDMRP help to onboard new supply chain talent into the inventory planning space?
Great question. I think because it is intended to be working from a more accurate signal, and it intended to be more that the material will always be available, we find that companies and their staff are able to onboard. And I think if someone comes into material planning as an example and they don't really have supply chain experience, I think it's a much more modern concept to work from. Because otherwise what you're dealing with in the convention of MRP is you teach them the MRP logic, and then you teach them not to trust it because you know the signals that are coming out are going to be wrong. And then oftentimes you teach them how to use a spreadsheet that the company's built to try to make some sense out of all of this stuff.
Right.
So I believe it's a much more straightforward path and one that's easier to adopt.
Great. And Scott says it's so much easier to onboard. So I think that that's a wonderful, wonderful comment. We've got about 2 minutes left here. So I'm going to ask you one more quick question. How did e-commerce affect supply chain operations? Let's end on that note. And maybe one comment about, do you think the post-COVID environment will cause faster adoption of DDMRP?
I think the important part of e-commerce, it was obviously another channel to market for products. But I think it came with one critical expectation, is that if I buy, I want it shipped today. Right. And I don't want to wait. So the impatience of the customer kind of rules the day. What that means is you better have that inventory and you better have the right materials on hand. And so if I'm planning to forecast and my forecasts aren't in line with what those users are buying, then I'm going to not available. And if it's not available, guess what? I look for an alternative, right? I've shopped on Amazon enough, as everyone has. Unless you're really fascinated about something unique about an item, you're going to find something that's close enough to satisfy that requirement. So I think the biggest factor to me is this sense of what we call customer tolerance time. How long will you wait to get what you want? And I think that time frame has shrunk dramatically over the last several years.
Well, it just goes to show how tightly collaborative customer service and customer experience is tied to supply chain. So yes or no, do you think the post-COVID environment will cause faster adoption of DDMRP?
I absolutely am convinced it's going to accelerate. It's working. I mean, it's working, and customers, once they adopt, stay with it. And I think that is a demonstration that it's serving a vastly underserved market. I mean, we went 2.5 decades where largely nothing really happened. And I've got a chart that shows this that we'll see in the next pitch, actually.
Right.
And I think that means that there's a lot of opportunity for us to make headway here. And I think the next several years, we're going to see vast improvements in the industry.
Great. Well, thank you so much all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the session and taken lots of value from it. Please do reach out to either myself or Erik on social media if you have any questions or insights you'd like to share from our talk today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this amazing conference. See everybody soon.